I've played tons of arcade games. Up until a few months ago, I had never taken the time to keep track of the ones that I had played, but once I started my conquest in the Konami library, I sat down and compiled a list of all the arcade games that I had streamed, beaten, and that I remembered. That's the purpose of today's episode, to provide you with a list of 10 games in no particular order that you should check out if given the chance. Again, this is not the best 10 games in the arcade spectrum in my opinion. It's just 10 arcade games that would make me feel like my $5 were worth something to me. Let's begin. I've mentioned this game, and I'll mention it forever, because it is very special to me. In fact, all entries of the 19XX series in the arcade would easily end up on this list, but this is the first in the series, and it's a game that helped put Capcom on the map, alongside a choice few other games. 1942 was not the first game from Capcom. That would be Vulgus, which is also a vertical shooter akin to Xevious, but I felt that 1942 was a game that was incredibly fun, albeit very challenging. I mentioned before that the 1942 NES port was a title that you should check out. I want you to understand that arcade ports, most of the time, are very, very different from the games in the arcade. 1942, the arcade game, will not hold your hand. Even the bonus planes that seem so killable and weak in the NES port are lethal as all get up in the arcade game. Bearing that in mind, this game is worth checking out if you like good, clean shoot-'em-up action but don't want to commit to the frustration of bullet hell games like I do. Capcom was solid in the arcade after the sunset of the arcade golden age. Their beat-em-ups in particular were placed in Chuck E. Cheese's around the country. I could easily sit here and make a video solely about Capcom beat-em-ups, but for the interest of variety, I chose two specific games that are in the same universe or setting, the Mystara setting of Dungeons & Dragons. The two games we're talking about are Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom and Dungeons & Dragons Shadow over Mystara. These beat-em-ups are a tad bit different from what you would expect from Capcom because it incorporates RPG elements. In between stages you can buy power-ups, there are numerous branching paths, so in many ways you're paying 50 cents to experience an entire adventure of your own choice in the arcades. It's also tremendous fun and was ported to the Saturn in the Dungeons & Dragons collection, as well as the Chronicles of Mystara, which is another compilation, and both of these games are included. The most recent Dungeons & Dragons game was, well, Baldur's Gate 3, and we all know how well that turned out, and dare I say it's about time that it was released. Way back a few years ago, I used to be sponsored by this unique project called AntStream. I'll link their client information down below. For those of you who don't know what AntStream is, it's an emulation service that carries tons of Amiga, DOS, Commodore 64, Atari 7800, NES, SNES, ZX Spectrum, Genesis, and more importantly, arcade games in a pleasant user interface that allows for save states, challenges, and in some cases even leaderboards. It's been a while since I used it, but the important part is, I was able to play this really cool game that busted into my room like the Kool-Aid Man. Elevator Action returns. Now, if you're older than me, you'll remember Elevator Action, which for the time was fun, but what would happen if you took those graphics and turned them up to a solid 50 out of 10 and made it even more fun? You'd get Elevator Action Returns. Again, I was blown away by how great this game is, and I was incredibly frustrated that I never saw it in the arcades growing up. I would have loved to have checked this out. The franchise has been relatively quiet, with the most recent game being Elevator Action Old and New, which was released in 2002. It was also only released in Japan, which kind of sucks. The cool thing about it is that you can change between the older graphics or the newer graphics, which are more chibi or super deformed than Elevator Action Returns. I love light gun games. I prefer games that involve gimmicks, especially in the arcades, which is why I enjoy rhythm games so much. There's just something satisfying about relying on a physical response that goes beyond simple reflexes and wrist action like a vast majority of arcade games. As one of the two franchises that really fetish-sized zombies, the other being Resident Evil, The House of the Dead is a wonderful Sega rail shooter that easily took most of my allowance as a kid. Built on the Virtua Cop engine, the devs really took their time to allow for unique choices based around how the consumer plays, and because of its success, it was the fourth highest grossing arcade game in 1998. To me, it's a clever series that still thrives to this day, with the most recent House of the Dead entry being House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn. It still carries on a legacy that Sega created, but heard it's kind of wonky. One of my favorite titles on the Nintendo 64 is Mystical Ninja, starring Goemon. I like the cute, carefree gameplay that still offered some challenge, so naturally I was curious to see where this franchise started, and lo and behold, it was a 1986 Japanese exclusive platformer that is addictive as meth. In the game, we play as Mr. Goemon, who runs to the right, whacking people with your crack pipe or throwing money at them. For those of you who are unaware of his story, it's a person called Ishikawa Goemon who was the Japanese version of Robin Hood. Apparently, he wasn't very good at his job because his dumbass became soup after the Emperor got a hold of him. True story. Mr. Goemon is the starting point for the franchise, but soon after Konami decided to mix it up a little bit with some 2.5D side profile games that involve exploration, or in some cases, 3D games. The most recent title was Ganbare Goemon Tokai Doshu Oedo Tingorikaishi no Maki. No, I don't know what that means. Yes, I can read Japanese characters. I'm trying to learn karate language. This is a game that caught me off guard. Most of the time, I go into playing games blind, and at the time, Konami was on my naughty boy list because they were releasing tons of bad arcade games. Then one day I came across Puon, the story of a mama pig whose babies have been abducted by some wolves. So what do? We wake up, walk outside, climb a ladder, and we shoot those fuckers out of the sky. How do we do that? With Mama Pig Vengeance and a bow and arrow set. This game is obnoxiously fun for what it is. I don't have much more to say because simplicity tends to explain itself, but I enjoyed this and I feel you will too. This is another game that caught me off guard because, again, it's stupid simple, and in the early years of the arcade, stupid simple was much more appreciated than stealing the formula for Space Invaders. Now, this game is hard to find because it is a very generic game name. In the early years of Konami, they developed games, but they weren't publishing them yet. They were published by Lyjack. It wasn't until 1984 where we had fully fledged international releases of games that had Konami's branding on it. Space War comes in a few flavors when it comes to the identity. Space War was released as Space War only in Japan. In America, it was known as Intruder, and in Europe, it was known as Space Laser. The way you play it is that you have one or two players basically trying to blast each other by charging up their lasers. In the middle, you have traffic that sometimes blocks the opponent's laser, but if you time it right, you can destroy either the target or the opposing player. Again, it's a stupid simple game, and it was a great time. The daddy of hack and slashes, this game is one of Capcom's golden standards that paved the way for games such as God of War, Dante's Inferno, and even Devil May Cry. I know I took a steaming poo-poo on Strider for the NES, because in my opinion it suffers from tremendous design issues, but the arcade version, it doesn't. You play as Hiryu, who is a member of a ninja order called the Striders, who are given a task to assassinate the Grand Master that is ruling the dystopian future of 2048. You can slide, you can grapple, you can climb the roof, you can jump and stick to walls. Strider was just dope as hell, and you should check it out. There's only 5 stages, so it is beatable in one sitting. It's a relatively short game. I know I mentioned the newest Strider, but I really want to point out that Strider 2 on the PS1 is a god-tier game that is worth every penny. Time Pilot is a Konami game with unique elements. It's a shooter, yes, but instead of the traditional format of vertical or horizontal, we have this awkward, free movement, loop-the-loop style of controls that are refreshing to experience. The whole premise of Time Pilot was to shoot all these bad guys until the big bad boy came. Then you could teleport to another time period, and as those time periods changed, the enemies became more and more contemporary. You deal with more challenges, i.e. you went from biplanes to fighter jets to helicopters with missiles to UFOs. That's Time Pilot, right? Now, the game I'm talking about now is Time Pilot 84, which is very, very similar to Sinistar, at least in presentation. Time Pilot 84 doesn't feature the time travel element like its predecessor, but it does have the same concept of kill a large amount of enemies and then deal with the big bad guy, whose AI is very similar to Sinistar, chasing you around relentlessly until you either kill it or take a missile straight to the forehead. If you're a Commodore 64 enthusiast, you might recognize this game as Space Pilot 2. If there ever was a game that would require you to have medical insurance for carpal tunnel syndrome, it would be Track and Field. Track and Field is part of the Konamic series, which was a franchise that was focused on Olympic Games. Track and Field is exactly that, a chance to participate in the Olympics without being remotely in shape, which is right up my alley with my rockin' dad bod. There are a few events, and many of those events require you to smash the buttons into oblivion, which was a big frustration to arcade owners at the time, but the revenue was there, so they just let the players play. These events consisted of the 100-meter dash, long jump, javelin throw, 110-meter hurdles, hammer throw, and finally, the high jump. 80s sports games, especially in the arcade, were very hit and miss, and this is one of the hits. But don't think it's easy. It isn't. There are optimal angles for most of the jumps and throws, and while it's difficult, it is fun. It was enough to make me buy the NES ports, of which aren't that bad either. As I continue my gaming journey, I know I'll discover even more arcade titles to share with you, and these are all fun games that I feel you should check out yourself. As always, feel free to hit that subscribe button, and down in the comment section below, tell me what our next 10-game series should be about. I've got a wide variety of topics that I can talk about. Also, if you don't mind, hit that thumbs up because it does increase our viewership. Slightly. And as always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortifire out.